Hello, my name is Stephen Gorard, and I'm talking to you today about conducting education research. And the specific issue I want to mention today is conducting interviews, or more accurately, collecting unstructured data. So, in the book, I try not to draw distinctions between the sort of methods of data collection so much as the kind of data collected. So you can collect structured and less structured data in your research and you can do both at the same time. And a lot of studies typically do that. It's not primarily about the scale or the method of delivery. So, you can do a survey face to face, you can do it online, you can do it over the phone, you can do it over pencil and paper, and so on. And the actual techniques involved are pretty much the same. There may be some minor differences to do with the method of data collection, but really not very much. So again, I mentioned in one of the early talks that the advice I'm giving is slightly different from what other people say, so-called experts, and this is one of them. Don't focus on the method of data collection. Focus on the kind of data that you're going to collect. And at extreme, there's a distinction between structured data, the kind where, for example, you might ask people a multi-choice question, which of these jobs is closest to what you do, which is very structured, and unstructured data, where you just really want people to tell you about their reasons, their explanation, their stories, their narratives. And today I want to focus on that. But just to give you an example, I've written two complete books, one called Creating a Learning Society and one called Adults Learning in the Digital Age, where there were well over 1,000 individual household interviews were done. And what that shows is it's not about, interviews are not just for small numbers. Interviews can be very large scale, and I've done, surveys with very small numbers of cases where there are only very few, but it has to be done in a questionnaire for particular reasons to do with privacy or intrusion. If you do structured data collection, then there's more initial work. So developing the instrument such that you can specify to people what the potential responses will be, requires you to do a lot of spade work, synthesis, to work out what those possible responses are. You can still have an item that says, is there something else you want to tell me? Please write it in here. But generally with structured data, you're doing all the planning beforehand. And the way to analyze that data is kind of obvious because you've just got all the numbers of cases who've responded to each of the potential categories that you offer them. It's not that with unstructured data, you don't have to plan. You still have to have a schedule, you still have to have an idea, but you're not presenting that plan or that structure to the participants in the research. That's absolutely crucial. It also makes it slightly harder to analyze less structured data. And you've got this huge problem that if you're asking people in effectively open-ended questions, whether it's either on paper or face-to-face to sort of fill the gap, you are likely to produce biased results in the sense that the people who are the most opinionated or the most literate or have the most leisure time or whatever, or the most interested in the topic, will be more likely to respond or to give you more responses than the people who are less so. Whereas with a questionnaire, if you're asking people, for example, to rate how important a particular factor is for them in choosing a career or choosing a school for their child, they can make it clear they're not interested in some of these things by giving a very low rating. In a way that doesn't happen when you ask people open-ended questions. So that's the disadvantage. It's going to be harder to analyze and you're likely to have biased results. And you need to take those into account when you choose to do something like an interview for unstructured data. But it has several advantages. First of all, of course, it allows for luck, serendipity. Now, if you over-plan your data collection, then you're kind of constraining people. They won't be normally imaginative enough or care enough about filling in your survey. They won't care like you do to point out that you've missed out a glaring example of a category. Whereas with people telling you a story, you're going to get a much wider range of data that could lead you to unexpected turns. And you might get fuller explanations as to why people say things or how they came to make a decision. So be clear why you're looking for unstructured data, right? Don't just do it because that's what people do. It is not simply a long-winded survey, right? I've had several, actually quite recent PhD candidates that I've been supervising who've done a lot of structured data collection or working with secondary data which is structured. And then they've decided, quite rightly, that they want to get some in-depth data to explain or illustrate some of the patterns that they've uncovered from the structured data. And they've written an interview schedule which just looks like a face-to-face questionnaire. Now, the problem with that is that when you ask people these questions, you remain in control. You're not giving control to the respondent, and they will tend to be much more brief, even monosyllabic. Have you ever experienced this? Yes. This is not what you want. It's not, you don't want a checklist, and you don't want to control the flow. I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. So you prepare the issues and the topics that you want, but encourage people to stray off the topics. Right? Do not make the whole process bureaucratic, with lots of form filling and consent and all that kind of stuff. Make it relaxed and friendly. As always, if it's in your office, offer them a cup of tea. Accept a cup of tea if it's in their office, and so on. I'm going to describe an ideal interview. As I've said before in this book and these videos, what I'm saying may be different from what people say, but for me, an ideal interview would look like this. You would go in to the setting, your respondent would be there after the basic intros and pleasantries that are involved. You have explained to them what the interview is about, and then you say nothing. And for however long the interview lasts, half an hour, an hour and a half, you say nothing more, and they just talk, and everything they say is relevant to what you want. And for me, that's ideal. You would be reduced to smiling, nodding, going, oh, really, that kind of stuff, rather than making any substantial contribution to the interview. Now, that doesn't happen in most cases. And I've sat with people doing interviews, I've done team interviews and group interviews and so on. And the people who are specialist interviewers, those people who say, oh, I'm a qualitative researcher, I only do interviews. Those kind of people are often blabbermouths. They cannot bear to be quiet for half an hour or an hour and listen to the story they're supposed to be interested in. They have to interject themselves into the discussion. But it's not about them, it's about the respondent. You've got to remember that. So in theory, if you said enough to get them to just talk for all of that time about your topic and everything they say is relevant, you should be deliriously happy and leave them to it. Your role there is to encourage them. Sometimes there's inhibition. People might be reluctant to talk about things, and we often investigate things which might be slightly sensitive, or we don't realize the sensitivity it might be to the individual or their biography. So your job is to encourage them if there's inhibition. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but also to get them to stay on track. So the ideal interview very rarely happens because people they either stop before you've covered all the things you want, or more often they stray off into something else that you don't want to talk about. And your job is to keep them on track by simple prompts. Can you say a bit more about that? Or can you explain why this happened? Whatever, that kind of thing. And it is conversational, but you're there, you have an agenda, you've got either under the desk or in your head a list of the things that you'd like to cover, and you want them to cover it. The order in which people cover those issues doesn't really matter. The whole point about unstructured data is it doesn't matter. So if the third thing you wanted them to ask about, to talk about, was covered first or fifth, doesn't matter. Don't stop the interview or try and rearrange the order. As I say, if what they're saying is relevant somewhere to something that you're going to ask them about or you want them to talk about, just let them talk. Don't try and control it too much. It's not about power. I think that's what. So, but give them some sort of grace time. People, when they start talking and you think, hang on, we've moved off topic now, right? There are several scenarios. Yes, they could have just rambled off onto something else. They could be building up to something and maybe be hesitant to say it. So this is just preamble. It's them trying to find the courage or the words, or to put into words the thing that they're going to say. So you need to give them some time to do that. Another possibility is that you, despite your supposed expertise in the area, just don't understand how what they're saying is going to be relevant. So don't butt in too quickly. Give them some space to develop a thing. And only if it becomes obvious they're talking about astronomy or, you know, what the government is doing or something, and these are not relevant to your topic, well, at some stage you will say, let's get back to this point. Yeah, you've made a choice to collect unstructured data by this interview or by some other means, precisely because you don't want to constrain what people are saying. So if you jump in immediately when people start talking about something which you can't immediately see the relevance of, then you're kind of denying or contradicting your reason for why you did the interview in the first place. And it does shock me when I see how bad interviews are done by people who only do interviews. And I wonder sometimes if they only do interviews because they don't know how to do anything else. But that's why I'm suggesting this about interviews. Allow the people to flourish and to tell you a story. Not everybody will be able to tell you about every part of your topic. And some people may not have experiences or may not have an opinion on it. You don't have to force it. This is not a survey. Let them tell you about what they do know and use that for it. And that's slightly different from the issue about, biasing the views of the most literate or the most opinionated. You can try and ask people, but if they don't have anything to say, then that's fine. There's lots of things I don't know, and people ask me about them, I just say I don't know. That's a perfectly legitimate response. And it is really, really exciting. It doesn't happen every single time, but if you let it, it's just amazing. I mean, I once was doing these household interviews with adults who had dropped out of school early, had never been to, post-compulsory education or university, and apparently never done any work-based training, not an apprenticeship, nothing formal at all at work. So they had no qualifications and apparently no skills. And we were trying to find out, well, how did people get to be in that position? And it's astonishing, and I've reported this in previous publications, how many of those people we were wrong about. But if we just stuck to the thing about qualifications and skills, we wouldn't have got to it. But when people start telling a story, and there's one I can only tell you an abbreviated thing. There was a guy in one of the coalfield valleys in South Wales who worked in the steel industry. And he was the guy that they went to fix the machines, because he was the person who could tell by the sound and the behavior of the machines what was wrong and fixed it. He had no engineering or mechanical qualifications, but he had that ability to do it. And he really was the go-to guy. In his house, he'd done all the plaster work. Some of it was quite fancy. I mean, it wasn't to my taste, but I was impressed by the skill, the craftsmanship. And he'd done this by copying something he'd seen in the Palace of Versailles outside Paris. And it looked a bit odd in a 3-bedroomed terraced house, but it was undeniably skillful. He had wired and rebuilt the house, amended the roof, and so on. He had about 5,000 bedding plants in the garden where he tended them and grew them up from shoots, not as a business, just to give to neighbors and friends and so on. And I can't remember all the things he did. He took me into his library. He said, "Oh, come and see my library." And it was actually his bathroom, because there was no room for the bookcases anywhere else. And he just had this array of books on technical issues he was interested in. He is exactly what would be called an autodidact, somebody who teachers themselves. And I was just in awe of this man and the range of skills, practical and other skills he had. He and his wife had worked to restore an opera house on the street where they lived. This was a rundown building, and they'd managed to rebuild it, repoint it, restore it, and they were opening up as a going concern, as a cultural centre for the community. My admiration for this man was unparalleled, and he wasn't an exception. There were several other people who had different things. There was one guy who had a tank in his back garden and so on. What the point I'm trying to make is that when you go out there and you look for people's stories, you've got to let them tell you. Because if I hadn't let him take me to the bathroom or show me his plaster work, I probably wouldn't have learned about all these other things, or take me into the garden to show me his bedding plants. When you're collecting unstructured data, it is precisely that, unstructured. And your job is to make sense of it afterwards. But while it's there, collect the rich data. Don't constrain it. Okay, that's enough for me on interviews.